I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation whose land we stand on today. I would introduce myself, and I guess I should say just a little bit more, and that I'm a Murray from Queensland, and I've lived here since 1992 with a couple of years in Canberra, perhaps unfortunately. I came here for university and I stayed for love, and that is land and men. When I was asked to talk today, it was specifically about whether Western Australian, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists participate in national discourse. I would actually say yes, they do, Aboriginal artists do. Not to my knowledge does Torres Strait Islander artists. They play a very small role in Western Australian art as I understand it. But yes, Aboriginal artists do, but they participate in only a degree and not as widely as I would like. And I'll come to that point. I would also like to note that these are my untested observations, so they're really here for conversation later and to generate discussion between yourselves and potentially me if you're brave enough to come up and talk to me. I'd like to define here national discourse. For me, it's a set of conversations and a way or ways of thinking about Aboriginal art, people and culture within the Australian art scene and general Australian community. And to measure Aboriginal artists' involvement, I'd like to use the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collection at the National Gallery of Australia as my yardstick of what and how WA artists contribute and participate in discourse. So a few stats. The NGA has over 1,000 works from WA. Whether it's good or bad, over the last 5 or 6 years, from 2008 to this point in time, in 2014, 43 works were collected. Of those 43 works, 39 came from the Kimberley and the Western Desert, and three came from Perth and the Southwest. This is roughly 14 works to 1 being collected in Western Australia. In this same time period, 24 works were collected within the first 2 years of its making. 4 works were then collected within 5 years of their making. And the last figure I'd like to share is that 6 artists in this time period had 1 or more works collected, so from 2008 to 2005. Admittedly, some of the people and artists whose works were collected in this 5-year range already had works in the NGA collection. What the NGA figures suggest to me is that WA Aboriginal artists are contributing to discourse about traditional cultural life and values, as well as experiences of living in country and on country. So those ideas about what it means to be a stockman, for example, or a stockwoman, comes to play. But the figures also tell me that WA artists contribute less, at least in the last 5 years, to discourse that touches on social and historical events and practices that continue to impact on Aboriginal people and well-being. I think it would be easy to conclude that WA artists do not participate in the full range and breadth of Aboriginal identity, culture and lived experience in the Australian public domain. Not everyone gets to have their say. In presenting these figures, I do not seek to criticise the NGA. It is simply my intention to demonstrate the division and preoccupation particular cultural narratives have for many Australian audiences. In addition, the NGA is not alone. There are other institutions, large state institutions, that lean toward artworks, contemporary paintings predominantly, that interpret traditional cultural narratives. So what is happening in the regions and what is happening in the city? In the regions, artists have art centres, and I think that is the primary difference that is going on among artists working across Western Australia. In the regions, more artists are working from art centres than individually. By this I mean they paint together, they paint communally. The production and output seems to be much higher from what I can see. And that is largely due to the invaluable support that art centres provide to these artists. Art centres are a machine that gets artists' works to market. And I think that that's is it a privilege or is it something that could assist all artists? I think artists in the bush are more connected to the art scene via these art centres than artists living in the city. So in the city, there's a handful of artists in Perth. I can't give you numbers, but I understand that they make work for public and private institutions, but they do it alone. I don't know of any artist collective, Aboriginal artist collective, in Perth today, and I'd actually like to see one. I think this is a serious problem, because if artists' works are not collected by these influential collections, then they don't join the conversation at a national level. Without a machine behind them, urban-based artists can and do struggle. And without the infrastructure, there are fewer opportunities to add to the conversation and to the way Australians think about Aboriginal art, people and culture. And also, without the infrastructure, there are few opportunities to travel and to join conversations that aren't happening locally. I think that there's an information superhighway going on the East Coast that you become a part of if you're moving around in those spaces. And I certainly know that I miss out on a lot of information because I'm based here as a curator. I would also add that this isolation impacts on artists, and I think it impacts on their skills development and ability to maintain a consistent practice. And for me, certainly as a curator, I need to be able to draw on consistent practice and a body of works to be able to support artists in shows that I do. So the differences between artists in the city and the bush simply forms part of an existing divide and a preoccupation that goes on about Aboriginal people, art and culture. I mean, it is the word insipid? It is everywhere. It permeates our lives as Aboriginal people, and potentially it permeates your lives and you don't even know it. Stereotypes about what Aboriginal art is, who Aboriginal people are, what we look like, how much culture we do and don't have, it actually drives me nuts because it invalidates most of us, in fact all of us, because we can never live up to the stereotype. And these sorts of stereotypes also privilege one dialogue over another. In effect, it makes us invisible. So what can we do to even out the dialogue and the contribution to national discourse for and by WA artists? Sure, we can bring more works here. That's also a costly event. I mean, it's quite hard to get money out of funding organisations, as everyone would be well aware. I also wonder if we take advantage of our disadvantage. What I mean by that is that if the market is so heavily focused on cultural narratives, traditional narratives from regional communities, why not offer something different? Why not show something that's different about, or is essentially about lived experience, but it doesn't look like the one that the audiences are seeking? I'd also say don't go it alone. As curators and as artists, because alone it's hard to grow. I would also suggest building networks. I really enjoy being able to go to Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. In fact, that's where my family lives. But to go to these spaces and be able to talk about things that perhaps I wouldn't have considered in my conversations over here. And I think it's that engagement that is most important about travel, not to be able to say that you did it, but that you can have different conversations. And like I said, I think that is there a possibility for an arts collective in Perth, an opportunity for us to pool our resources so that we can talk to each other as well as talk to people in the other states. Some people already do this, some people already travel, and in fact I'd like to commend Chris Goggin and Archua and Desart because they provide so many professional development opportunities for their artist members and arts workers, and it's those sorts of opportunities that help grow the industry and help to change discourse. Thank you.